Hello and welcome to a brand new video. Last time we looked at Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason and his transcendental idealism, and today we're going to take a look at his moral philosophy. While they're both grounded in pure reason, I feel like his moral philosophy is much easier to understand. So to begin, according to Immanuel Kant in his work on the Groundworks of Metaphysics of Morals, there's only one thing that's good in itself, which is the goodwill. Everything else has to be qualified. The goodwill is something that is good without qualification. While other things can be good, the goodwill is good in itself. For example, being intelligent is a good thing, as one can use their intelligence for something like curing diseases, but they could also use their intelligence for evil, if the goodwill isn't present. And courage can be a good thing if to save someone out of a burning fire, but a thief would also have courage when robbing a bank. And being healthy could be good, but without having a goodwill, one could have vanity in their looks. And having good virtues is such as moderation, is a step in the right direction, but they have to be directed by the goodwill. So Jeremy Bentham, for example, would say that the goodwill is what leads to the best consequences or utility for the highest number of people. But Kant would disagree with that because he would say it's not really about the effect or the consequence, but one has to examine the will directly. So the goodwill is good through willing itself, or that it's good in itself. Even if the goodwill can't bring its desired consequences, it can still be good in itself. A good person has the freedom to choose to have a goodwill, and one needs to have motive to fulfill the goodwill or duty for its own sake. And this is why his ethics is known as deontological ethics. And he says that our rationality and our pure reason directs the goodwill. So he's in looking at Revelation, for example. And the implementation of the activity of the goodwill is known as practical reason. And why were we given this reason by nature? It's not purely for happiness, according to Kant, for a few reasons. First, if it was solely for happiness, then he defines this as the desires and inclinations for the individual being satisfied, and this would make us purely instinctual beings, and this isn't the case. Secondly, if one was to use their reason to reach happiness, they'll obviously be unhappy at the end because they would be deeply thinking and planning about how to achieve happiness, and that's quite heavy relative to the one who has no plans and who accidentally bumps into happiness. And reason isn't purely for survival as well. And the goal of reason is something higher than happiness, and it's, according to Kant, doing duty for the sake of duty, and this is the goodwill, and that's the good in itself. And reason is the tool for enacting practical reason. And the pure concept of duty, according to Kant, contains the goodwill. So either actions can be either against duty or in agreement with it. It is possible to perform one duty, but for the wrong motivation, and only the correct reason to do duty is for its own sake. For example, a merchant ripping off his customers is against duty, but to give him a fair price is in agreement with it. However, he should give a fair price because it's the right thing to do, rather than doing it as a means to another end, such as self-interest. So we should act out of duty, not just in accordance with it. Furthermore, an action is done from duty it's in accordance with the maxim that it's done according to. And we're going to look at his categorical imperatives that lays down each maxim. And one should also have reverence for the moral law. And why should one have reverence for it? It's because it's the right thing to do, according to Kant, and therefore one ought to do it as an imperative. And as rational beings, we can respond to the different imperatives, including the right ones and wrong ones. So, according to Kant, in order to be moral, one has to have the correct imperative that goes with each action. So, he makes a distinction between what he calls categorical imperatives and hypothetical imperatives. And hypothetical imperatives are done for the sake of another. So, for example, if you want to get good grades in your philosophy class, then you should watch my videos. It's a means to an end. A categorical imperative, on the other hand, is universal rule, which is done for its own sake rather than a means to something else. So the categorical imperative is at the heart of Kantian moral philosophy. So it informs the individual of what duties are, and since the categorical imperative is universal, that it's the duty that all humans share. And Kant formulated the first categorical imperative as the following statement. He says, quote, act only on that maxim which you can at the same time will it that it should be a universal law. So what that basically means is, if an act is moral, then it should meet the criteria of universality, such that everyone from any time or context should do it. For example, lying is wrong for all places, for everyone, in all times, in all places, and all circumstances. Furthermore, it should be willable such that if you were to will it, there must be not any inconsistencies or contradictions. And it might be in a way, consequentialist, as you have to look at the end results of the willing to see if there's any inconsistencies of making a universal law. But then again, for Kant, it's not about the effect of the universal law, it's about the principle behind it. And since many people make exceptions for themselves, a good person must push themselves in order to fulfill their duty. And in the following, like the categorical imperative, even if it goes against what they want, they should still do it, because they should follow their duty just for its own sake. So as we've been mentioning, that the categorical imperative must be universal. So if we took the opposite, he says lying is, always bad. If we say lying was only good, then if it was a universal law that everyone should lie in order to get what they want, then the idea of keeping promises becomes void. And rational beings would want their powers to be developed in their best ability. So Kant wants people to be happy and healthy and educated as well. So then the question becomes, for the student of Kantian ethics, is that whether the formulation of the maxim that is to be willed universal law is it always going to be general, or is it always going to be specific? So for example, if lying is always wrong full stop as a universal law, or it could be a maxim, then what happens if you have to lie to save someone's life? Do you lie or do you tell the truth? And both could be made a universal law that could be willed, but Kant would most likely, in my opinion, say that he would argue that it has to be general. Since if we start making exceptions or qualifications, which humans have the tendency to do, then it's no longer universal law. So I would say that Kant is a moral absolutist. And according to Kant, people are in ends in themselves, and their value is their dignity due to being rational beings. And this leads to the second formulation of the categorical imperative, that is, quote, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always as the same as an end. So due to our will as rational beings, we're able to subject ourselves to these laws universally to be moral agents. So when we act towards an end, it is determined by reason alone. And the means is the method to which we reach the end goal. And there's a distinction between subjective ends, which deal with our desires, and objective ends, with the latter applying to universally to all people. And some things are valuable as a means to certain ends, but people, including yourself and myself, as rational beings, are valuable as their ends in themselves, and not a means to another end. And as for our free will to make these choices, this is something that Kant says we need to presuppose rather than prove. And furthermore, free will is only exclusive to humans as they're rational beings. And our will doesn't act arbitrarily though, and it acts on the laws imposed upon itself, such as the categorical imperatives. And while there's to be other causes that affect our free will, they're not determined, only the categorical imperative is. And there's also a third formulation of the categorical imperative given by Kant, which is the principle of rational or practical reason. And basically this determines our duty as rational beings. And the motive for doing a moral action, according to Kant, in this third formulation, is based on the maxim of turning it into what he calls universally legislative will, rather than being based on any interest. So Kantian morals are based on duty, as previously mentioned, and it is to recognize one's universal with duty as the principle of autonomy. So when one recognizes and acts upon this, it would be what he calls the kingdom of ends. So when everyone recognizes this and acts upon it, the kingdom of ends is where every person is treated equally and as an end in themselves rather than means to an end. And every person in the goal of achieving a possible kingdom of ends is subjected to the legislative duties as rational beings with human dignity. And besides giving his own system of morality, which we've been talking about for these past few minutes, Kant also critiques others, and this is called the heteronomy of will. So while the autonomy of will is to choose to follow duties for their own sake and to give yourself these categorical imperatives, heteronomy is the opposite. So he lists as the heteronomy of will the following. He says that individual happiness or success, empirical happiness, which is the moral feelings such as compassion or empathy. He lists the rational principles of perfection, such as becoming the best person you could be, such as in virtue ethics. And lastly, he criticizes my beloved divine command theory, which is basically that rules are given by the divinely perfect will and the knowledge of God. So for the first theory, he states that there are bad people who prosper and good people who suffer for being good. And furthermore, he imagined if you told a child that they would be rewarded for good behavior for a piece of candy rather than telling them it's a good thing to do in itself. And as for moral feeling, morality can't be based on feeling because feelings are uncertain and unreliable as a guide, and it can be changed or can be confused, and they're not objective as they differ from person to person. And morality it's basically a morality for people who don't want to think, according to Kant. And the problem for virtue ethics, according to Kant, is that it's indefinite, as there's no end goal for perfection. And as for divine command theory, he states that we don't know what a divine will is, so therefore we can't act upon it, which is something I completely disagree with. But at least for moral feeling, according to Kant, it attempts that there is something desirable in morality. And that basically concludes Kantian ethics. And I hopefully that you enjoyed this video and learned something, and if you did, please like and subscribe.